each part of revisioning psychology really is
Hmm.
a sort of descent into what I like to think of as streams of soul, streams
Mm.
of the psyche, uh, these timeless undercurrents. And he's not talking about techniques so much as movements that we can tap into and cultivate. And so yes, if you can get on board with this sort of meandering or circumambulating, you are sort of sinking down into these real deep foundations of the way we engage the world.
Glen Slater, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to see you again, Brian.
Yeah, we're here for round two of our James Hillman Archetypal Psychology 101. And I was wondering, I mean, I didn't go to college. So if you've got the 101, I kind of get that. You get like the kind of the foundation, the introduction to a subject. What would be the next level? Would it be 102 or 201?
Yeah, well, particularly with something like Hillman, he's generating more of a perspective or a sensibility. So it's very cyclical rather than linear. So I don't know how you progress. Most of my colleagues are going back to revisioning psychology, for example, on a regular basis. Um, each encounter brings something a little different because as you find in Jung, he's talking about something that's living, the psyche, the imagination. Yes, but well, we'll start where we can.
Yeah. Well, I did want to focus on revisioning psychology, which I see as his magnum opus or his big kind of coming out with his perspective of archetypal psychology, kind of like setting the ground for everything that would come later. And it was based on a series of lectures he did at Yale as part of the Terry Lecture Series. And I find that really interesting because Jung himself did a series of Terry lectures, right? Decades previous. And so there's this nice kind of sense of continuity, like taking Jung's ideas, which were so foundational for Hillman, and then spinning them in his own way, twisting them, turning them on their head, adding to them, removing, doing his whole work. I was thinking this morning, I was out for my run, and I was thinking like how often Hillman is characterized as a deconstructionist, right? And he kind of like
Hmm.
clears the ground, and then there's like no structure, and like what the hell do I do with this? But I thought actually like it's not just deconstruction. Like a lot of what he's doing is like a reconstruction. Like maybe he's deconstructing to get back down to the fundament, which for him was like the Greek psyche, the Greece of the mind, and all of these ideas and perspectives that have been kind of paved over in the postmodern world, right? And then maybe doing a little building on top of that, but it's like a deconstruction reconstruction project. It's not just kind of clearing the ground, right?
That's right. And this just to draw out a couple of pieces, what you put on the table already. Yes, the Terry lectures, the continuity is not just only in the fact that Hillman followed Jung, but also the Terry lectures typically have something to do with religion, and both Jung and Hillman were addressing psychology and religion. Um, Hillman in a very roundabout way, which we'll get to when we talk about the end of revisioning. Um, but that's an interesting point of continuity. How do you describe the overlap of those two huge areas of human experience? But I think you're right. The deconstruction construction in order to revision psychology. And in order to bring new psychological insight, Hillman's constant preoccupation is with our habitual ideas and our habitual ideas in psychology. And he takes on a lot of conventional thinking in order to clear the space to put something new on the table.
Hmm. Another way I've been thinking about him recently, because like when I really got into Hillman, I already had this background in yoga, and particularly like the yogic philosophy in Patanjali. And there's something about Hillman's work that is a kind of tantra. And I've been like kind of mulling this over and wrestling with it. Like to me, there's something there. Like there's something, it's not that reading his work will help you get to like a beginner's mind as some kind of blank slate. Like that is part of it. Like really paying attention to the, here and now experience, what's happening phenomenologically. But it doesn't put aside or leave behind everything that we bring from the past. And a lot of like what he's trying to do in his work is to recover or recuperate things that have been left behind. So there's this great like historical aspect to his work, but there's also bringing like that freshness of perspective as well that seems kind of paradoxical or something. So it's hard for me to articulate, but do you follow what I mean there in terms of like how engaging with his work could act as a kind of yoga?
I do, and I think we talked a bit last time about the Senex Puer pattern, which we basically think of as old and new. And when we think of the imagination, our tendency is to think imagination has everything to do with what's new. But I think the imagination is stirred by the contact with the past, by the teachings of the past, and of course we have the challenge of bringing them into our own lived experience. But that I think is where the imagination really kicks in, and a central concept in revisioning psychology is what Hillman calls epistrophy. This is the reversion to the more essential archetypal ideas, that somehow that feeds the imagination. And I think the parallel we can keep in mind in terms of this practice is the indigenous one, which is that the indigenous are always concerned about the ancestors, and the ancestors in psychological terms is really the archetypal world. So there are these timeless ideas, but they need to come into the world again and again in creative ways. So I think that's what Hillman's up to in revisioning psychology. That these four parts of revisioning psychology that we're going to talk about, they pertain to sort of age-old currents of the soul, and yet tapping into them can revive something of our here and now experience.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to think of it is like related to the Senex Puer, that they aren't in opposition to one another, but that they are two parts of a whole. Yeah. The historical and the new and the future. That they function better when they're together. Something like that, right?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so 1971, is that when he delivered the Terry lectures? Somewhere
Uh,
around there?
71, 72 maybe, and then revisioning psychology, the text came out a few years later, 75.
Hmm. It's a long time ago, but like you said, I keep going back to revisioning psychology, and it's like there's always something new because I think part of that is because it's so dense And there's so much kind of background to what he's laying out in the book. And he doesn't like kind of hold your hand, and make sure that you're up to speed. It's like you gotta kind of catch up to him if you don't have the same background that he comes to these ideas with. So that, and it's so what would you say, cross-disciplinary. Like he thinks that psychology needs to include the historical background, the philosophical background, the religious background, the medical background, like all of it. So he might drop a little reference to something, and then it opens up this huge area of study if you want to really get, how he came to the idea that he came to. So it's a very dense work, and it is a kind of maybe the kind of the blueprint for a whole education in the Western mind and Western culture and civilization itself. Like if you really follow some of those breadcrumbs, it's going to keep you busy for a while.
Hillman had this thing about systems. He didn't like systems or systematic thinking. So revisioning psychology is a little like the work of the bricoleur, that French term of pulling together these disparate pieces. And he has no qualms whatsoever dipping into this piece of history or bringing in Renaissance philosophy or moving into other dimensions of the arts and literature as needed uh, in order to amplify and deepen a particular point, but feeling no need to sort of systematically wrap it all up. So the experience of reading revisioning psychology is that your mind is going here, there, and everywhere. And often my students say, I've read this thing, I've underlined every second line, and my head's still spinning. I don't
That's funny.
quite know where I am. I've gone somewhere, but I'm not sure.
That's funny, yeah, because going through my paper copy, yeah, I've got so much underlined, page numbers circled, sections highlighted with a question mark beside them. It's like, needs more research, needs more study to fully understand what he's talking about here. Um, and I like that. He comes right out at the beginning, I think, and says like that, yeah, he feels no need to make sure that everything fits together in a nice package. And I appreciate that. It brings like a real kind of hermetic quality to his writing, and then reading him invites you into that if you can get over your kind of desire to have it all put into bullet points and numbered lists. Like what I noticed too is that often in a few of his books actually he'll start by laying out like a list. He's like, okay, here's some rules of thumb. And then he'll start with one and go to two, and then he forgets what number he's at, and he just kind of like leaves that behind, the idea of creating a list. And it's in revisioning as well. That happens at one point where he starts kind of like, okay, I'm going to lay it out for you, and then he kind of just leaves it behind and leaves you hanging.
It's true. I think the counterpoint, there is certainly this hubbub of ideas going on, but each part of revisioning psychology really is
Hmm.
a sort of descent into what I like to think of as streams of soul, streams of the psyche, uh, these timeless undercurrents. And he's not talking about techniques so much as movements that we can tap into and cultivate. And so yes, if you can get on board with this sort of meandering or circumambulating, you are sort of sinking down into these real deep foundations of the way we engage the world, and the way we make soul. So soul making is the project in revisioning psychology, and soul making has to do with refining our perspectives because he saw soul as not a thing, but a perspective. We talked about that last time. And
Mhm.
so soul making is working on the way we see. And so that's really what the text is about.
Yeah. And it's such a great title. He always, he always plays with words, and I love the double meaning of it. Starting at the point, okay, what's the vision of psychology that we currently have? What do we learn in school? What's the received wisdom? And then let's take another look at it, and bring in all this stuff that's been paved over or lost or left behind or denigrated in some respects, right? So let's start chapter one, personifying. And I like how every chapter title is a verb.
Yes.
I mean, even that, his choice to make it a verb and not a noun is speaks to his opposition to like nominalism as one of the things that gets in the way of, you know, soul making his particular way of doing psychology. So let's start with personifying. And one of the ways I thought that we could set it up is first talk about like what he's revisioning in each case. Like what is the kind of like the standard mode of mainstream conventional psychology? So personifying versus, let's say, personification,
Mhm.
or what he calls the shadow of personifying, which is this denigration of personification,
Mhm.
right? So let's talk about that. What is he in opposition to?
Let's step back just a
Okay.
little bit and think about the way, for example, Jung would say that we're in the psyche's not in us. And I think Hillman's version of that is that we're in the imagination's not in us. And so what we're revisioning from the get-go is this fantasy that we're imagining in this kind of egocentric way, that we're the creators rather than something working through us or happening to us. And so he's pointing out that, of course, we have this notion and experience of personification where we look at what we think of as an inanimate object and we give it a name and we sort of think it has a personality and so forth. But the contrast, the experience of personifying, is more the spontaneous feeling that something is animated, that it is speaking to us, or that we need to speak to it. So I often the easiest way into this is to for us all to realize we all personify when we're at the limits of our usual everyday consciousness. For example, we start talking to our computers when they stop working, right, and our ego task has been disrupted, and all of a sudden here you are, you're having a conversation with this device. And that's the sort of reversion to the personifying mode. But of course, it's already given with the psyche, because when we dream, we don't dream in sort of abstract notions and concepts. Our complexes, the impulses within us and so forth, always show up as persons. Um,
Right.
and
The psyche is personifying, and when it's not interrupted or blocked, as in the dream state, when the day ego is asleep, it's personifying all the time. You're not dreaming abstract ideas or, right? Like you're
right,
dreaming in persons.
that's right. And to the extent that the dream allows us a window into what's going on the deeper layers of the psyche, um, then that's how the psyche works. So the whole idea here is for us to awaken to this personifying mode and what lives there. And this, of course, goes with the more poetic uh, way of thinking too, because the poet sees the subjectivities out, spreading out like into the world rather than it all being in us. And that brings with it a sense of soul. So one of the examples that Hillman gives in the book is that you're an author writing a novel, and of course, when you set out, you're thinking very consciously about the kinds of characters you want and so forth, and you work on their backstories. But then you get into the midst of writing, and the characters take on a life of their own, and as the proverbial reflection goes, the writer wants to kill the character off, and the character says, "No, I'm not ready to go yet." That's personifying. You see, it's there's an otherness, there's an experience of otherness, and it's not meant to be metaphysical or spiritual, but imaginal, psychological. It's what Jung calls a psychic reality. It just is that way, that this other character is speaking to you, or your old car, for example, that you have lived with for a long time, and you have to kind of cajole into cooperation. That's a real experience. That's
Hmm.
different from naming your teddy bear. That's experiencing something as having a personality, and so personifying is really about embracing that sense, cultivating it, noticing when it's happening, because that brings with it a feeling of depth and soul.
Yeah, I think of it often as just like actually allowing what is natural to us to do.
Yes.
And kind of like questioning that voice that comes in and says, "Oh, come on, you're just anthropomorphizing your dog or the computer or your car. That's silly. That's like child stuff." But just to like, if you can like shut that voice out, it's a naturally occurring thing. Like you said, people start shouting at their computer as if it's an agent, and it's got some say and it's like against you and it's like trying to thwart your plan to, type up your grocery list or whatever it is, right? Or watch your movie. Um, and
Yeah.
and just allowing that is like kind of a recuperation of that natural human instinct to personify.
Yes, and it exemplifies what you opened with, which is that all these chapters are pushing against something. And so what this chapter is pushing against is that secondary commentary that we bring in and say, this is anthropomorphizing, or this is just childish, or, at extreme examples, this is kind of craziness,
Hmm.
or so forth. And then we disparage this sort of deeper, more natural current of the psyche, which I think is also about a kind of enchantment.
Hmm.
That when you live in a world in which the subjectivity is kind of all around you, there is just that feeling of mystery and magic and so forth. Again, not in a kind of woo-woo metaphysical way, but just in an experiential, imaginal way.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that kind of, for each of these sections I wanted to get to, like not just what he's kind of pushing against or opposing, but also okay, why? Why recover this attitude or mode of personifying? And I think, yeah, so that's it, is it re-enchants the world. And there's been a lot of people who've talked about the disenchantment and what that brings, the sense of loneliness and isolation and meaninglessness, all of that. So it's kind of restoring that. And I just like to keep stressing that it's not something that you force, because
Right.
that's just like the anthropomorphizing, if you're kind of like forcing it to happen. But if you just get out of the way and you allow it, you'll find yourself personalizing or personifying.
It brings in love. This is one of his main points, that when there's personifying, there's eros, because it's
Hmm.
now between you and some other presence. And so what comes with that? A deeper sense of reverence and curiosity. And I think in the end, more consciousness. Um, and you know, it um, the opposite, when, as he points out, when you don't have a sense of soul persons, when you don't have the awareness of archetypal figures, and you're living in a completely rationalistic way, what happens? Well, these soul figures come back unconsciously, and they start inhabiting actual persons, because the actual people in our lives, they're the only ones that we then in that rationalistic mode give credence to. But then we end up, for example, mistaking the priest for the priest, capital P, because we don't have an archetypal idea of the spiritual leader. We don't see that the man, the priest, is inhabiting an archetypal field. Or we don't have the idea of the anima, the personification of the soul. So we visit that on some poor, partner in our relationship, and all of a sudden they're carrying this archetypal presence. So to cultivate a personifying sensibility is to realize, oh, there are these archetypal figures that are inhabiting, our relationships with other people. And if we have a sense of that, then actually we better relate to the actual person. So I think this is the upshot of developing this particular stream of consciousness.
Hmm. Yeah, and just to kind of pick up on that idea of love, um, you know, being engaged in yoga and being interested in world religions, I think there's a kind of genius to the polytheistic religions with their pantheon of different figures who embody different aspects of life, whether they're forces of nature or qualities like love and beauty, um, because we're fundamentally relational beings and we don't relate to abstract ideas. There's no love, there's no relationship. We use ideas. We
Mhm.
don't relate to them. And so
Mhm.
we need a figure or a personification in order to feel the connection and to have that relationship and for it to be constantly renewing. So you've got a deity who you kind of like are attracted to and you find beautiful or intriguing. Like when I was a kid, I bought all these posters from Little India of all the different deities. There were these like really colorful kind of comic book style images of all the different Hindu deities, and I had them up on my wall just because I thought they were so like amazing and fascinating and fun. And it was like, wow, look at Hanuman. He's this like superhero monkey with these like big strong legs and this mace, and Ganesh has got his own kind of playfulness, and so there's something about that. It's like it connects you to your heart, and that's such a deep and important connection. And yeah, so it's like it also gives you that care for the world because you're related to it. And one of the things that we see when we're not related is we treat the world like just a pile of resources for us to use. Whereas if we're in love with the world and we're personifying continually with the world, we're going to care for it. All of a sudden, that tree is not just a bunch of wood that I can put in my wood stove. it's
Right.
this it's a guardian, it's a protector, it's nurturing all of the life in it. It's a home for the squirrels and the birds. And like, man, the last thing I want to do is see that tree come down. Like
Well,
that would hurt my soul.
that's all well described, and I think to draw out what you're saying, you not only have that deficit that comes with just the objectification of everything, then you require a secondary level of ethics and moralistic thinking in order to know how to behave. Um, I, I remember in a seminar with Hillman once, he gave this compelling little example where he said, you're walking down the street with your kid and they drop the candy wrapper on the ground. He said, don't say to the kid, oh, that's wrong, that's breaking the law, pick it up. He said, if you leave the candy wrapper on the ground, it will be lonely. So why don't you pick it up and put it with its friends?
In the trash bin, yeah.
Yeah. And so there's just like a very, very subtle, simple idea of bringing in the personifying. Um,
Hmm.
it's a mode of imagining, but it's one that sort of brings with it it's a built-in sense of
Hmm.
and attention.
Yeah. Yeah, I talked to Lawrence Hillman a couple weeks ago. People listening, it's James Hillman's son, who's an archetypal astrologist. And I was asking him, like, what was it like to grow up with him as a father? And, like he was a busy guy, kind of absorbed in his own world and in his work. But the interactions that he spoke about were very much like that,
Uh-huh.
you know?
Right.
Because I was asking him, like, yeah, how do we help keep children's imagination alive? What are some things that we can do as parents or uncles or aunties or, and it was like little things like that, he said, you know, just that different perspective, like, oh, don't leave that wrapper on the ground because it's going to be lonely. Not because you're a litter bug and you're bad and it's wrong, but we don't want that little wrapper to be all alone blowing around by itself. We want it to be with with his friends. That's great.
Yeah, he helped me years back before I was married, and we were talking about marriage, and he said that we're so caught in the personalizing idea that marriage is this person and this person, and somehow it's all about how the two of them work it out. But he said, really, there's a third thing, which is the marriage.
Yeah.
And thinking of the marriage as its own, in a way, presence that also needs your attention, that needs to be kind of made room for. And you see how that then shifts the whole way of imagining things, that there is this other entity, and you have to pay attention to that. And then the idea is that, well, if you tend to the marriage, the relationship goes much better.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't know actually that he had that view because that's something that I come to in my own marriage. And that when I counsel people who are struggling with their marriage, not even calling it marriage, but they call it the partnership, right? These two individuals working together to, maintain the household or whatever, right? And I bring in that idea of marriage as the third thing that we're serving, that we have an obligation to. And that takes us out of our kind of individual needs only. And
Mhm.
if we're serving this greater thing that we're both a part of and contributing to, it not only like, I don't know, it lets off the pressure of the individual and we got to work it all out between us, but it gives us something greater that we're building. And you could think of it, the marriage is like your idea of a beautiful life together or an artful life. And like God, like let's just work on that project instead of our own personal foibles and trying to like smooth out all the kinks and everything.
Yes, yes. So you can see the way in which the personifying gives way. It opens the door to a whole different means of engaging things.
Right. Yeah. And just to be very clear, like we're talking about personifying marriage. And you could see this in the images of the conjunctio in alchemy,
Correct.
the, yeah, great. Okay. Chapter one.
All right. Chapter one.
Let's move on. Chapter two, pathologizing or falling apart. I like how each chapter also has this like or just like falling apart. It just adds this extra little thing in there. First, let's talk about like how pathology is normally understood or viewed in conventional psychology.
Well, it's normally understood or viewed as abnormal.
Right? And it's bad, it's negative.
Right, right, as anomalous. And so right there, that's not very phenomenological, is it? Because we all experience difficulties. We all have struggles, we all have complexes, we all have moments in life where we do fall apart. And if we didn't, we wouldn't grow, we wouldn't develop, we wouldn't bring in other sensibilities and so forth. So there's the pushback and the correction right there. But I suppose he takes it deeper into critiquing the whole medical model uh, of psychopathology, which is, to oversimplify it perhaps, focused on first diagnosis, so therefore naming what this thing is, and then treatment. And to the extent that you're caught up with those things, you're uh, not attempting to understand what's going on, to listen to the problem, to as I like to remind people, to think of the symptom as a symptom. Why is it there? What's it pointing towards? What is the deeper purpose? So of course this point of view is an extension of Jung's idea that the symptom comes in order to move the psyche in a particular direction. But Hillman's really giving a very radical texture to that particular idea.
Yeah. Like the conventional idea that pathology is something's gone wrong in the person, and we need to cure the symptoms. We need to get rid of the symptoms. And he's saying, no, we've got to listen to the symptoms and follow the symptoms. I think like what was helpful for me in understanding this, because it's such a contrary idea, was just doing the etymology on psychopathology.
Mhm.
So psyche, pathos, this like this cry of the soul. And then the logos part of it is like trying to understand it or try to like find the meaning in this cry in the soul. So all of our symptoms being our soul's way of trying to get our attention, to create a movement or make something happen, or to let us know that what we're doing is harming the soul. I mean, radical. First of all, you have to start from the ground of like respecting, or I don't know, like respecting the idea of soul or believing in the soul, right?
Yes, and then to have a more expansive sense of soul, because in our new age way of talking about the soul, we think it's all on the side of well-being. But what Hillman's
Right. It's our
reminding,
divine essence and it's the spark of divinity in us.
or yes, yes, and to some extent it is those things, but
Hmm.
but Hillman's reminding us that pathos, suffering, and soul also belong together. That how is it that we go deeper, or that we discover we have these other dimensions to us, that we are a kind of bunch of complexes, that we our characters do come out of our early difficulties and so on and so forth, that that the soul is wedded to the area of pathos. And the nutshell version, somewhere in the chapter, he says, we fall apart in order to find the parts.
Mm,
That's the essential purpose. And there's another fantasy, though, that can easily kick in, even when you have this idea that, oh, there's a purpose to the symptom. You can also fall into the resurrection fantasy, and as we know, Hillman did a lot of pushing back against the way Christianity unconsciously gives us the glasses to see the world, and then we think, well, all suffering is about discovering something and then coming out that after the death there's always the resurrection. But
mm,
he's trying to retrieve the idea that there's a value in the suffering in and of itself. It kind of darkens our eye and cures our naivete about things, so that we're initiated. As he says somewhere else in revisioning, we're all Persephone being abducted into the underworld. Um, and the result is what? Um, Less sort of egocentric assurity and more contact with that like stuff of life, which is a mixture of togetherness and fragmentation, and that seems to be important in terms of standing squarely in the existential moment as well. I love that line he quotes from the novel Franny and Zoe, where he says, one of the characters says, this is Kali Yuga, baby. If you don't have an ulcer, you're a goddamn spy. Uh, I, so there's something in this chapter that helps us, I think, just stand squarely in what it means to be alive at this particular juncture in history.
mm. Yeah. So also when you're talking about the kind of the redemption fantasy, I think about the hero's journey and how, it's often applied to suffering. Well, you're going through this because there's something for you to learn and you're going to come back with this gift and then it's yours to offer the world. Like it's like what we're doing with the suffering, rather than, like you said, the suffering in itself giving something. And like, going back to Keats, call the world, if you will, a veil of soul making, in
Right.
opposition to the Christian idea that the world is just a veil of tears and, it's not our true home. And eventually we're going to be out of here and we're going to be in heaven at the right hand of God and all of that stuff, right? But no, like why do we suffer? And even like getting to the idea that it's because we have a soul that we suffer. Without the soul, we don't suffer because it's the soul that suffers. And so it's also, the suffering is pointing us to having a soul or being a soul or, right?
Yeah. It, it's something he comes back to in this chapter and elsewhere, is that there is a tragic stream that runs through life, and it's just there. And so why don't we adjust ourselves to that rather than try to keep running away from it? I mean, it certainly allows us to be then more empathic with others, we might
Hmm.
say, better therapists, better friends, more understanding partners. There are these gifts that come from that darkness in and of itself. So he's trying to help us imagine into suffering in a different way, so that we become better sufferers.
Hmm.
If that's not too much for people to take.
Hmm.
is we are going to suffer. How do we suffer in a more imaginative way that also has a kind of poetry to it? Because of course tragedy is also poetic.
Mm. Yeah. And I think like what you're saying too is important, like the gifts that suffering itself brings, one of which being empathy. And if we're following from chapter one, if we somehow, I don't know, recover our personifying nature, then we're going to see the world as suffering. And maybe that's going to help us become better stewards of the world, right?
Yes, and perhaps also by um, embracing more fully our own character and calling, which is often
Hmm.
wrapped up in our particular form of suffering. This is a point he makes in the chapter, that our peculiarity is entwined with our suffering. And so
Hmm.
how do you grow down into yourself except through that? Um, the John Updike, the novelist, has a memoir that is really very illustrative of this, because he suffered from psoriasis. He's pretty open about this in the memoir. Um, but he in one part of this book, he says, what did the psoriasis bring to me? Well, it brought me the sense that I could only make a living by sort of sitting inside and being by myself and not exposing myself so much to the world. In other words, he was telling us about how in his own way of imagining his own life, his calling as a novelist was wrapped up in this symptom of psoriasis. And then that's just the way that delivered itself. And
Hmm.
so this way of seeing things then helps us recover a sense of the essential value um, of the suffering. Um, and again, it's a whole different way of imagining, but as you say, one that pushes against the habitual medical model, reductionistic, pathologizing in the generic sense of that.
Hmm. Yeah, just following on the Updike thing, that's great. It's like psoriasis was in his acorn because he was meant to be a
Yes.
writer and, you know, yeah, be stuck in or be in an office for like whatever 12 hours a day or something like that. I also have been thinking about it as like a negative calling. So what really causes us the most grief? You
Mhm.
know, what causes us the most suffering in the world? And then following that, right? So if like something about the world is just causing me a lot of grief and its absence, well, maybe that's pointing me towards some kind of niche or something that I'm meant to contribute to the world. But it's doing it in this negative way. So it's like not paying attention to some positive voice who's coming in and saying, you need to be a writer and get your ideas out there. But it's like, man, nobody's talking about this aspect of life. Or like Hillman, like nobody's speaking about soul anymore, even in psychology, which is supposed to be about the science of the soul or whatever. Um,
Yep.
and so that kind of idea of negative calling, which is related to our suffering, right?
Yep. This is a big part of it, and it goes to what's arguably the pivot point of this second chapter, which is the way he works this well-known uh, uh, passage from Jung, where Jung says that the gods return as symptoms.
Hmm.
Um, Zeus no longer rules Olympus, but the solar plexus, and so on and so forth. And I often like to immediately turn that into an attitudinal thing, and pose the question: if there are gods in our symptoms, if we were to really embrace that, how then would we be different in relationship to the symptom? We would think, as you're just describing, there's something discoverable. There is an inherent value here, and maybe I'm not engaging that on the right level at this particular time, but there is a way of um, of living into that. You know, I think we mentioned last time that Hillman would turn to depression, obviously, as being one of those symptoms that's so widespread, but also because he had a, a really deep appreciation for the whole tradition of melancholy and how melancholy has been handled down through the ages. And and he would dip down into that because if we want to put it this way, the melancholic imagination gives us a whole different perspective to the symptom of depression, right?
Hmm.
Um, you know, the way people would uh, treat melancholy very often had to do with finding soul food, finding ways to just be in their experience, to embrace themselves, and particularly to get out of the kind of manic pace that appears to give so much rise to our depressive symptoms, the demands and pressures and so forth.
Yeah.
So the point is that when we talk about a God in the symptom, we're not literally saying, oh, you go into your symptom and there you find, you know, um, Aphrodite or you find Hephaestus or something. You find a value, an essential value, and perhaps a timeless piece of human experience.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're both married to astrologers, and I think astrology does these first two moves really well, the personifying and the pathologizing, or respecting the symptom or seeing the God in the symptom. And then, like you said, how does that change your attitude toward a symptom if you think that there's a God behind it somehow or a value? Well, how would you relate to a God who's angry? Well, maybe you're not giving it enough attention. You're not propitiating the God. You're not giving it offerings. You're not making space for it on your altar. Um, yeah, and I think, astrology, well, good astrology, I think does that really well when it's not just about personality types or whatever, like the Ficino style of astrology.
Yes, it helps us imagine into there's an alive cosmos, which is different. I mean, just hear the difference between that and, you know, perhaps the Christian idea that yes, God has sent us our difficulty and we've got something to learn from it, but it's packaged a little bit moralistically.
Oh, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, it's totally corrective, right? Like
a,
you're being
a
sent this.
corrective, right,
Yeah.
right. So it's not quite, you know, it's not the idea that, oh, maybe I'm getting to know God more through my suffering. It's that God is teaching me some kind of lesson. So
Yeah, like how I've been sinning. It's yeah. Um yeah, I just wanted to touch on like a couple of the oppositions that he points out to pathologizing, and we've kind of covered them, but just to name them. So the first is nominalism. So I think, the medical model is really guilty of that, of just like ascribing a name to a group
mm,
of symptoms. And like in that example of depression versus melancholia, like when you look at the history of melancholy, there's so much rich imagery associated with it. There's like the humors, and then there's like the paintings of Dame Melancholia with her dog, and all of this, like they're
mm,
so imagistic. Like again, it helps us be in relationship to our melancholy and to find the value in it. When I'm melancholic, maybe I'm brooding, and maybe it's like I'm coming to some new perspective or new ideas are brewing, or so, and I need that downtime, that insular downtime, in order for this stuff to come to fruition or something, right? Um, But with the nominalism, it's like we lose all the images. Now depression is just like a list of symptoms, a bullet point list. And how do I engage with that? Well, I don't know. I don't know how people engage with it actually without personifying it or finding the images in it. Um, and so like even like the way that we talk about the symptoms, like I think, for people who are practitioners, it's like, well, how do I incorporate this? I think one of the things I tell people is just start to listen for the images that people are already bringing to your sessions when they're talking about things like their depression. They're gonna speak in images because it's like there's the poetic basis of mind that we talked about last time. It's like our language is metaphors all the way down. So you're gonna hear people say like, sometimes I just feel this like crushing weight on my chest and I can't get out of bed. There's an image to work with all of a sudden,
Yep.
right? And so just like to tune your ear to the images that people are already bringing to it, just as a simple way of like bringing some more depth into the therapy work that you're doing with people. That's a good place to start.
And the image is such a vivid contrast to the explanation.
Hmm.
The image is a piece of life, and the explanation is just a little trick of the mind. And I think that that nominalistic stance is what partly gives rise to our like look for the explanation. And there's a whole bunch of people sadly walking around in the world thinking my depression is a chemical imbalance. That's
Hmm.
it. And end of story. And then I need the right pill. And that's what my depression's about. It's anomalous. It doesn't have something to do with my life story. And I think that's one of the saddest things that's happened.
Yeah. So the two things that he talks about there in the kind of opposition, one is the medical view,
Mhm.
and then which is what you just described. There's some chemical imbalance in my brain, and I got to take some pills to fix it or whatever, or do other practices. And the other one is the religious view, which in the case of depression might turn up as something like, well, I'm not eating right. I'm not doing enough exercise. I'm sinning, and this is my punishment for my sinning,
Yes.
right? Yeah. Yeah. So a couple of the other ways to deny the value of the symptom, nominalism, but then what he calls anarchic nihilism, which is very interesting because it's like the kind of mode of someone like R.D. Laing. And I just had a couple of people on the podcast who are part of this whole mad movement of kind of destigmatizing the idea of madness. And this is what he's talking about here is the idea that any of these symptoms, there's actually nothing wrong with them. So it's kind of like the opposite to the typical pathologizing, right? Can you give a little bit of perspective on that? Because it might be hard for people to grasp like why this would be a kind of a wrong move.
Well, depth psychology has a long history of critiquing the culture. And I think that's very important for us to be able to see that what passes as normal is often neurotic.
Yeah.
But it's a whole different thing to do that inversion you just described and say that, well, therefore, everything that's wrong with me belongs to living in the wrongness of society. And then it seems as though you've completely dissipated the psychological tension, as Jung would describe it. You've actually stepped out of your experience into a kind of dissociative state, as I think is how it would end up being lived. It's another kind of explanation, but it's not really serving the process of deepening. It
Yeah.
doesn't come with anything of psychological substance.
Right. Because you're just like you're really going with the symptom and you're not trying to investigate it. You're not asking like why it's here because it's a given. Well, of course, you're mad because the world is mad and you're just like reflecting back the madness of the society. And so, what happens if we just allow that? I don't know if there'll be any like kind of psychological movement or transformation that comes out of that.
Yeah.
Because like you said, you lose the tension. And when you were speaking earlier, I just thought about like, this kind of urge to explain as part of the nominalism. Uh, I thought about like, well, yeah, it's true. There's often like this urge to explain versus understanding. It's like I see those two things as in opposition. Like explanation
Yes.
just kind of flattens everything, kind of wraps it up in a tidy package. It's like, okay, I've got all the bullet points. Maybe we'll add a couple bullet points here or there, like in the DSM. But we've explained this symptomology or this diagnosis rather than really understand it. And yeah.
There's a third position here, which I think is a bit more fruitful, which is the kind of canary in the coal mine
Mhm.
uh, situation, where someone can look at their suffering and say, well, this does have to do with me and my life and my character. But at the same time, part of the meaning of my life is to be sensitive to what's going on in the world, to actually register in myself what is wrong in the world. So, and I
Mhm.
think Hillman was very clear that seeing that was important too, that this was part of recovering a sense of the anima mundi, that your symptoms don't just belong to you in a personalistic, reductive way. They
Yeah.
belong to a sort of field of experience, but that doesn't mean you can't take responsibility for how your ability to respond to their presence.
Yeah. Yeah, that it resonates with something I talk about when working with psychedelics, the difference between like a Western psychotherapeutic application of psychedelics versus an indigenous model. Just the basic thing about like in the Western model, it's about my individual healing. Whereas in the indigenous model, an individual in a community might be manifesting some symptom of the sickness in the community. But
Mhm.
it's not about treating the individual, it's about treating what's going wrong in the community or in the world.
Right.
And so that's an interesting move that relates here. Before we go to chapter 3, let's take a little break. Hey, if you haven't already, take a moment, like this video and subscribe to the channel. It actually really helps. And look, if you really want to support the podcast, consider becoming a Patreon member. Starting at just $5 a month, you get early release of all episodes weeks before they're out to the public with no ads, no interruptions. We do a monthly call where we get together and we talk about topics like the one we're talking about on this podcast, me and you and other cool people. And you get other stuff. There's a private RSS feed that you can subscribe to and listen to extra bonus content on your favorite podcast player. It's really great and it's growing. So go to patreon.com/howl in the wilderness and join up. Yeah, I really appreciate you doing this with me. I know it's asking a lot.
Yeah, and I like what you're bringing in too, because of course you work with employing these perspectives. So yeah, I'm glad we can go back and forth that way.
Cool. Okay, so one last form of denial that I think most people will be more familiar with because, in the years since Hillman wrote this lecture, it's become more like the number one way of denying, listening to our pathology and respecting it and seeing the gods in it and all that. And that's the transcendental form of denial. You want to talk about that a bit? I think people immediately get it though.
Well, I think the term we use for this is the spiritual bypass, right?
Right.
And and Hillman, writing in the mid 70s, was eyeing the rising engagement with Eastern philosophies in the West, And so he has some really quite remarkable passages of what happens to Eastern thought when you uproot it from the muddiness and dirt and chaos and but more than anything else, as he described, the richly pathologized imagery. You go to a Hindu temple in India, and it's a sort of pandemonium almost of there's like monsters and sexuality and eating and devouring and then you plan it at some yoga studio in Santa Monica and it comes out like just smelling of sandalwood and it's you're splitting the archetypal nature of the character, and then it ends up becoming a technique for getting out of your suffering. Now, I would say that meditation and other Eastern techniques can offer a very important way of just getting enough distance from your suffering and to be able to be like hold it more consciously without dissociating, and that can be very important. But people do seem to use these methods as more of an escape,
Mm.
and that's what he's calling out.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you might get at a meditation retreat is the idea of disidentifying with a symptom, with an emotion. But what you don't often get is the personifying. And so I think the personifying is actually it works on a number of levels. One of them is the disidentifying with it, from the ego's point of view. That's built into it. And it does it not just making it some abstract idea like there goes my anger, this thing over there, but like, ooh, Mars is here. Mars is really showing up in response to what's going on the news, let's say, with my computer. And so you get an image, you get a person there to start to relate to. But it's also doing that disidentifying thing, right? That kind of the separating. So I think like for me, the personifying is the better move. It's like you get the two in one. Because like you said, that might actually happen in that kind of culture, like in a yoga culture. That's like a kind of an inbuilt part of it. But when it's sanitized in Santa Monica, you just get the cleaned up part of it, which is like, it's not mine. This anger is not me, whatever it is, it's not me. This cancer is not me, because like I'm not really the body, actually.
I think you're describing the loss of the peculiarity of the symptom that sometimes in Eastern practice, all of the different kinds of suffering become a sort of amalgam into, well, this just is part of the human condition and the stuff of life and sort of the samsara kind of world that needs to be uh, stepped beyond in some fashion. And I think what we're talking about is a way of deepening into the actual nature because there is a value there that needs to be extracted. So you could think about it in terms of your complexes. We all have these complex laden reactions to things. And if we just put them all together in one basket of, oh, that's my anger, that's my reactivity, and
Mm.
how do I get over that sort of reactive way of being? And then I learn nothing about the origins of what it is that I'm most reacting to and what that says about me and so forth. Uh,
I'm
yeah.
I'm smiling and kind of laughing here because you're reminding me of a yoga teacher who was very influential in my life, who's from New Zealand, so similar accent. But his whole thing was when we were talking about something like Shanti. He you'd say, yes, we say it means peace, but really it means non-reactive. And so when we're chanting Shanti, we're saying non-reactive, non-reactive, you know.
Right. And of course, we all want to cultivate that skill of not being eaten up and pushed
Yeah.
around by our emotions. So a little bit of distance goes a long way, a little bit of a capacity to stand back. But yeah,
Well, you don't want to get possessed by the archetype. You want to be in relation to it. And if
you
you're
want to
in
be in
relation
relation.
to it, there's a better chance of you not being possessed by it, from it not sneaking up behind you and kind of grabbing you like a hand puppet.
Right. And so I don't want people to go away with the sense that these techniques and perspectives can't be valued. They can be of tremendous value, but perhaps when they're extracted from their original context and then applied without some of these other ideas in mind, they can yeah lead us astray.
Yeah, and having spent many years in the kind of the spiritual world, I'll tell you, there is no transcending these emotions, these gods, these archetypes. What you call transcendence is often just repression. You know?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Spiritual communities are notorious for the return of the repressed,
Oh
the
my
the
God,
way the passion.
the passive aggression in those communities is off the charts. And plus you've
Yeah,
got this whole spiritual language that you can kind of weaponize against people.
right, right. So the point about the transcendent denial is it doesn't work in the end. These things catch up with you.
Well, I think it was interesting too. So he's not just talking about the kind of the spiritual transcendence, but he was also talking about like, well, he says body highs, weekend highs, LSD highs. So it's kind of easy to get like how something like LSD and psychedelics could help you to deny your pathologies, but also like the body highs maybe feel a little counterintuitive to people. Like, well, aren't we supposed to go into our body and feel the sensation of the emotion?
Mhm,
And he was reacting to a lot of the stuff that was coming out in the late 60s and early 70s out of places like Esalen and Fritz Perls Gestalt and the kind of primal therapies and all that. And he saw that, like the primal therapies in particular, as a kind of regression to like a pre-linguistic animal state, which is of course something that we want to include, but he wants us to remember that we're part animal and part angel. And so actually learning how to speak about our experience, our pathologies, whatever it is, and not just getting caught by the fantasy of the primal state or something being more real or more true.
mhm.
Am I reading that right?
Yeah, it's a complex thing, isn't it? Because that movement of the 60s and 70s was a reaction to ways of life that seemed to disown uh, the passions and the emotions and so forth. So that seemed like there was this corrective, and um, but you can get you can get into your body and into your emotions in a way that's merely cathartic and not insightful. And so I think that's the critique when those techniques simply turn you into an experience junkie that all feels good, but then you come out the other side and your consciousness hasn't expanded, not really, because you don't have insights into the real nature of what's going on, the background, and yeah, I mean, I used to do work around the breathing techniques and cathartic experiences and so forth, but it was always an attempt to contextualize it in the the more analytical process, the
Hmm.
need to sort of interpret the experiences or at least amplify them in some fashion.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think Hillman's contribution, like so much emphasis on ideas, is illustrated by what happened in the men's movement that, really poet Robert Bly started in the 1980s, and then it really kind of caught steam in the 1990s. What he was finding was that a lot of the exercises that they were doing with men was really about the catharsis,
Mhm.
and that men became catharsis junkies. So they would
Mhm.
come to these weekend retreats, they'd emote, 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 and it became, it could be very performative at times. I've seen it myself where it's like, oh, that guy, he's the guy who always gets on his knees and wails every weekend, he does the same thing. But then no real transformation takes place because there's been no insight and understanding, right? And so one of the correctives that Bly made was to bring in Hillman, who really did not fit with that whole primal men's movement thing. He was like an egghead, but he brought him in because he said this movement can't just be about catharsis. There has to be ideas, and there has to be substantial ideas. So him bringing Hillman in was his way of injecting that movement with some ideas, which is
Yes.
interesting.
Yeah, the ideas and the images, because the images help bridge the experience. But the point is, it's one thing, it's very easy to go out into the wilderness and get in touch with the wild man, but how do you bring the wild man back into the office Monday morning, or into the relationship with your partner? I mean, that's the point, is to recover a deeper sense of your masculinity, but in a way that's going to add a different color, a different inflection to the way you're going through life, not simply to kind of go from one side to the other.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, how do you integrate the wild man into your Monday to Friday work week? That requires imagination. Because what otherwise happens is, well, I just get to express my wild man on the weekends, and then I'm buttoned up Bob Monday to Friday at the office.
Mhm.
But if you work with your imagination, you're like, okay, so I'm at that board meeting and it's really dull. Like, what does my wild man want to do in that situation? Because he's there.
Right.
I'm just like been repressing him this whole time. And
Yeah.
so, what he might do, well, he might take off his shoes at the very least to feel a little more human in this
Mhm.
sterile office environment, like spread his toes out a little bit, or he might want some plants in his office cubicle, or whatever it is. He might drape a piece of leather on his foam chair or something. I don't know. But like, it's the imagination that helps you integrate some of these archetypal realities into your whole life.
Yeah. 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 Well put. Well put.
Okay, well, man, I knew it was ambitious to try to get through all four in, an hour and a half or whatever it's been. So I think we're going to have to stop here and pick it up again to cover chapters 3 and 4, which is probably fine because this is, I'm sure, been a full meal for a lot of people. And one of the things since I've been kind of revisioning psychology is thinking of doing a nice slow read through with a group
Mm.
online.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people have been reaching out to me going, what about this idea or that idea? And this stuff does take time. Every little idea could open up a whole new vista for you. So we want to give it some time. So that's something I'm thinking about just for people listening. It's like, okay, it's too much, or I want more, or whatever. But you're also teaching an in-depth course on this through the Cosmos Institute, right?
Yeah, I am. And so the way we're doing it is we're taking, a full hour for each of these four parts, as well
Right.
as, moving slowly, having 2 or 3 sessions to work our way up to revisioning psychology, and then having a couple of sessions out the other side to sort of show these ideas at work in some different areas. So it is hard terrain to cover very quickly, and maybe with the reading exercise, it would just be so valuable to pick out a couple of key passages and
Mhm.
just work with those a little bit Yeah, and that's my strategy in trying to teach revisioning psychology is just to point out some anchor anchoring moments in the chapters that help people to say, oh, okay, now I've got something to navigate it by.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Glenn,
Right.
thanks a lot. Again, I really appreciate you. And yeah, it's wonderful to be able to do this with you because you've been teaching this stuff for like 20 years or whatever it's been. So you've been immersed in it and you've taught it to, freshmen and people like new to this stuff. So you're the right guy for the job. I'll say it again.
All right. Well, it's been a rich conversation. So thanks, Brian.